name is Damian John. I was born to Ed John and Sue, now Muirhead. My dad is a Tl'azt'en Nation member, and that makes me a Tl'azt'en Nation member. We live as a people up north in the Fort St. James area of the world on a lake that's now called Stewart Lake. And my mom is German, Austrian, Hungarian, Irish, big mix. Yeah, I've been an artist full-time artist for about 4 or 5 years now, but I've been an artist my whole life, just creating things. I think most of us are some version of creator, so. The Indian Act is this alive piece of law and governance and policy in relationship to how does the Canadian government work with Indigenous peoples. The problem with it is it's built by the colonizers, it's built by the empire, it's built by the military might, and it doesn't really look at Indigenous input from anywhere in the country for the most part, little bits and pieces of it. And it's built around a system of assimilation. It's a way of our government to get Native people to not be Native anymore. It's insidious nature. If you look at it on the surface, it has qualities of this is what Indians get and this is what white people get, and how lucky that Native people don't have taxes when they work on reserve or something like that. That's how it's seen from a really cursory viewpoint. From the late 1800s through to the mid to late middle 1900s, the policies were continually more controlling, more rights were removed, more walls were put in front of Indigenous peoples, and that shifted in the 80s to some degree as we evolved into a more diversity welcoming place to live in the world. That shift has been good, but it's paltry in relationship to the affect of the old versions of the Indian Act. On one side of my family, there's not a lot of problems in terms of addiction and in terms of how to survive in the world. And on my Indigenous side, there's a slew of heavy issues that my cousins and my family deals with on a day-to-day basis. And it's not because they're brown. It's not because of their skin color. It's not because Indigenous folk have a propensity to be shitty or to not want to work or whatever it is, whatever the thing is. It's because of these policies. It's because of these impacts that our government has applied to us over time. And we're reeling. We're in that stage of reeling, and we're collectively in a stage that's pretty free and much better than it was 100 years ago as individuals, and we have lots of agency in how we can move forward in the world now. But people's lives have been ruined like completely for generations. It's not just one person or 2 people or 4 people. It's a whole group of people, and there are people within that who have been resilient, who have been amazing, who have managed to take all the trauma and create lives for themselves that are beautiful and awesome. They're still dealing with the trauma. They're still dealing with that thing. It's not like it's gone because they have succeeded financially. There are generations and generations of issues that have shown up because of these policies. And do we have the collective wherewithal to address those things? I don't know. I don't know if we have that capacity as a culture and as a country. I wish that we did. It would be nice to think that we would say we made a major mistake here and move forward with it. But it's outside of my ability to know what to do next, especially as an individual. I think this kind of knowledge making is useful. And then what? Once we have more people know what's going on and what has happened and have an empathetic response to it, what do we do then collectively? how do we heal some of those things? There's little groups and lots of people doing those things all over the country. Is there a way we can make it bigger, better? I'd like to see that, because I know some of the impacts of those things. I have had a lifelong relationship to comics in some way or another. Kind of opened my mind up to universes that didn't exist. Like Jack Kirby had these crazy, beautiful, colorful worlds on other planets, and there was the supervillains, there was the superheroes, there was the tension between those two. They were always flawed, except for maybe Superman. He was never that flawed, but everybody else was flawed. It was always the cover. It was always the cover that would be what is this about? And you can only save the day so many times, so many ways before you have to start thinking, how do I construct a new story device with this character? And one of the ways they did that was they would create a new universe. And then they got into this explorative phase of completely shifting the universes altogether. Like the modern version of it is Spider-Man has always been white, but now in some universes he's not, he's black. That plays into this set of work where I've been thinking all the way along of not just using the covers as a place to draw people into a story that has existed, but also thinking about the covers as creating a storyline for universes that either haven't existed or that could have existed or that can exist. For me, it's been fun to, not just fun, but therapeutic to evolve other ways of thinking about the story that is Canada, the story that is First Nations, Indigenous peoples in Canada, all of the effects from the various governance that our Canadian government has applied over the years. And yeah, I like thinking about alternatives, and not just alternatives of what if it had looked like this, but we always have these choice points. So we're making a new story for the future people to look back on and go, oh, what if they had made this decision? Sometimes you can't control what's happening, but a lot of the time you can control yourself within that broader dynamic. And I think that's what some of these alternate universes did for me, even from those formative years where it was like, oh yeah, there's other ways, there's other stories. We're not stuck in the one. And that's what I'm trying to invoke a little bit with this art project. People really close to me, who I love and care about very much, were in residential school and have forever been marred, scarred by residential school. And by extension, I have as well. There's not an Indigenous person in this country that can't say that residential school hasn't changed things for them. Most residential schools were, in my research, awful places. Just even from the basic standpoint of removing children from their main family unit and culture. Not to say all of the other crazy nonsense that has gone on in residential schools. I don't even think I can really imagine what the world would have looked like without residential school, because I've lost so much knowledge of what the world looked like pre-colonization. Tl'azt'en people, my people, had a way of engaging with the world around them that, as I understand it, was like a symbiotic relationship. They lived in a world that could have gone on in perpetuity. And so my imagining of a world without residential school is something like, something where people like that exist, but I don't know if I know what that looks like really. And it's deeply sad, it's a deeply sad space for me to have lost that knowledge or that knowing. And maybe it's in my bones somewhere, maybe I can feel that in my bones and I can express it in certain ways. And this was trying to imagine somebody like my father being able to run wild and free in Tl'azt'en and speaking the way that they knew how and being the way that they knew how in the world. And I think there's some hope in there too. There's hope in the cover that, yeah, we've done bad things and shitty things to one another, but maybe we can make it different for some of those who are coming down the road from us. I'm not an Indigenous woman, but I have all of these women in my life who have been affected by these things. Indigenous women, because of misogyny, because of men treating women badly historically and even currently, have a more complex set of circumstances to deal with than an Indigenous man does. It's all complex, but it's more complex for Indigenous women. And Indigenous women have been dealing with this preponderance of violence, and not just violence, but a lack of interest in the violence that's been done to them. This cover kind of pulled all of it together because I could have shady images of a number of the types that would have impacted or have impacted Indigenous women. And I also wanted to have some essence of the challenge show up. It's a big challenge to deal with this violence that is occurring. I didn't want to make Indigenous women appear to be victims, because all the women I know are these strong and beautiful people in any number of ways, and I wanted to reflect that. Like, in spite of all of the challenges, Indigenous women are still here. They're still fighting. They're still challenging the system. They're still surviving at times. They're thriving in other times, and they're bringing to the table something unique. Bizarro is a character in old Superman comics who does crazy things. He speaks and does the opposite. His powers were the exact opposite of Superman's. And conveniently, he's super white. So it was a good character to pull into this whole conversation. In this particular cover, the original Superman's getting judged by a group of Bizarros, female and male Bizarro characters. And I thought, well, that's cool. I imagine an Indigenous person would have felt like that when he encountered some of the craziness that was the Indian Act. Within the Indian Act, there was a policy that was, or an amendment that was made in the late 1920s that made it so that Indigenous people could not solicit, they could not get a lawyer, or they couldn't hire somebody to help them. And it was in direct relationship to land claims, and it was punished by fines and jail terms. So this cover pulls into the jurors a number of prime ministers, and Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the superintendent of Indian Affairs, who's notorious in the world of policy making for Indigenous folk of the time. So the person on the stand is going, this is so weird. Like, how can I exist in this world where I'm trying to follow your sets of rules and yet you keep changing them on me? What do you do? How do you ever challenge anything? How do you ever create something new? How do you say, well, wait a second? This cover was trying to reflect that. This stuff's hard, like the Indian Act and racism against Indigenous peoples, it's hard information. It's not Sunday reading. So I thought, is there a way to use the cover to draw people into this hard subject matter and make it approachable in some way? And that was the first cover. It was just like a mashup of, how can I have a lot of this information about residential school thrown into a cover? And it seemed to work. It worked pretty well, that first one, and so I was inspired to do more. And what I found as people have looked at the art is there has been reflections of that. where at first there's the ease, and then with certain covers for certain people, and depending on who they are, all of a sudden there's an impact space that they hadn't maybe realized before. It's hard information. It's really hard for me to share. It's hard for people to take in without being defensive. If you're not Indigenous, there's guilt and all sorts of stuff that can show up for people, anger, defense, everything. So are there ways to have this information shared so that people, I don't know, start to inform themselves better about how we are with each other in the world? Ultimately, that's kind of what I'm looking for, is those little things, because I don't think this art show will change the dynamic of the human culture that's happening, but I hope that it will influence it in a way that gets us thinking better about how we are with one another. The Indian Act is this alive piece of law and governance and policy in relationship to how does the Canadian government work with Indigenous peoples. The problem with it is it's built by the colonizers, it's built by the empire, it's built by the military might. That plays into this set of work where I've been thinking all the way along of not just using the covers as a place to draw people into a story that has existed, but also thinking about the covers as creating a storyline for universes that either haven't existed or that could have existed or that can exist. For me, it's been fun to, not just fun, but therapeutic to evolve other ways of thinking about the story that is Canada, the story that is First Nations, Indigenous peoples in Canada, all of the effects from the various governance that our Canadian government has applied over the years. And yeah, I like thinking about alternatives, and not just alternatives of what if it had looked like this, but we always have these choice points. So we're making a new story for the future people to look back on and go, oh, what if they had made this decision? People really close to me, who I love and care about very much, were in residential school and have forever been marred, scarred by residential school. And by extension, I have as well. Tl'azt'en people, my people, had a way of engaging with the world around them that, as I understand it, was a symbiotic relationship. They lived in a world that could have gone on in perpetuity. And so my imagining of a world without residential school is something like somebody like my father being able to run wild and free in Tl'azt'en and speaking the way that they knew how and being the way that they knew how in the world. And I think there's some hope in there too. There's hope in the cover that, yeah, maybe we can make it different for some of those who are coming down the road from us.